Morning, everyone. I have 10 o'clock on the dot, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, welcome to everyone who's joining us this morning for our member-only curator conversation. As always, my name is Elizabeth Darling, and I'm the manager of membership and annual giving here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And we're very excited to introduce our newest associate curator, Elizabeth Klaczynski, who will lead us on a discussion of a brief description of her CV and what brought her to the museum, followed by a discussion of the emotional history of slavery in Virginia, which I know for me, I'm very interested to hear Elizabeth's talk. And as always, if there are any technical difficulties when you're on the Zoom today, please put those in the chat and we will do our best to assist you with that. There is also closed captioning available for those who would like it. You can navigate to that on the menu bar of your Zoom program. And throughout the program, if you do have questions or comments, feel free to add those in the Q&A function of Zoom or in the chat, and we will have time for questions with Elizabeth at the end of the program. And with that, I will pass it off to Elizabeth, and I'll come back on at the end for Q&A.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It is great to be here. Thank you guys for having me. As Elizabeth Darling said, I'm the new associate curator here at the VMHC. I have been here for about 4 months. I'm coming from the Library of Virginia most recently, where I was the education and program specialist. Most of my experience has actually been in museum and cultural institutions, sort of education and programming. So this is a really fun and exciting transition for me. So rather quickly too, I completed my undergrad at Rice University. I did my master's at the University of Oxford and a PhD at University of Virginia. And, this is a topic that I was always really curious about. Sort of a driving question that I've always really had is like, why and how did slavery happen, right? So a really tiny, small question to answer. And in all my studies, I found many answers, many justifications, but no really good answer. So I unfortunately cannot tell you why and how it happened in a definitive way. But what I really want to do with this talk too is just raise questions, get everyone's sort of minds pondering these big ideas, these big questions, and also relate this history to our current moment. You'll see here up on my screen, we have some images, some text. We'll be exploring sort of a very brief chronology of the history of slavery in Virginia, but this talk is really also about how to read the archives. So we'll be deep diving into sources like these, the ones that I'm sharing here on my screen. I really think this will allow us to sort of peek into a window into people's thoughts and lived experiences from the past, which allows us to connect with the humanity of the people in history, even if we don't necessarily like what we find. Again, this allows us to not only better understand the past, but kind of gives us tools and questions we can use to confront our present moment. So here you'll see we have an advertisement that appeared in the Daily National Intelligencer in Washington, D.C. from a firm called Franklin and Armfield. If you're not familiar with them, they were based in Alexandria. They were one of the largest, if not the largest, slave trading firms in the United States in the antebellum era. And we'll talk about them later. We have a quote from Landon Carter. So if anyone's familiar with the Virginia FFVs, you'll know the Carter family. Very important here. Some of his enslaved people had run away following Lord Dunmore's proclamation in 1775. And he's talking about a dream he had about them. So there's kind of a lot going on. These people were definitely in his mind and on his thoughts, and affecting his sort of unconscious, seeing if it was a dream. And here is this really evocative painting called Behind the Myth of Benevolence by an artist named Titus Kaphar in 2014. I just think this is a really powerful image that really connects sort of the myth of Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers to their reliance on enslaved labor in a very, very powerful and evocative way. But to start, you can get my screen. What does emotional history mean and why is it important? Emotional history is sort of a newer frame through which to interpret history. It's basically studying how people felt about a certain event, topic, culture, etc. Why is it important? I think it allows us a much more nuanced and human look at the past, which gives us greater insights into a culture's values and norms. And again, it really allows us to relate to people in the past as people, not just as abstractions, and kind of gives us a deeper sense of the historical record. And yeah, I invite you to leave your initial thoughts in the chat if you are so inclined to just sort of gauge your reaction to that. So first, I kind of want to start again with a brief chronology with the origin stories. Europe and Africa, a lot of people think Europeans first encountered Western Africans in the beginning of the slave trade in the 1400s, which is categorically not true. But our story sort of starts there. The Portuguese, of course, were the first European colonizers to begin the slave trade on Western Africa, followed by the Dutch, Spanish, and later, of course, by the British. These sort of first contacts, the first beginnings of again, the slave trade, a lot of it was religiously justified. There was a lot of sort of proto-nationalism as well that allowed Europeans to see Africans as lesser people that were deserving of enslavement. And of course, zooming back into the Virginia story, if you are familiar with early Virginia 17th century history, you know that Virginia was a pretty terrible place to be. Mortality rates were pretty horrific. There was a lot of political and cultural and social instability, a lot of violence, not between just the colonists, but also between the indigenous people here in Virginia. So it was pretty awful. The predominant method or source of labor was indentured servants. So there were a lot of people, usually typically poor people from England and different parts of Britain who indentured themselves. So they agreed to come and work for people here in Virginia for a certain amount of time. And if they fulfilled their contracts, then they were allowed to go free afterwards. Unfortunately, the first few generations, because the mortality rate in Virginia was so abysmal, many people did not fulfill their contracts and died before they were allowed to be free. Sort of the paradox too of early Virginia was there was a lot of land available, essentially stolen, as we know, but there was a acute labor shortage. So in order to grow tobacco, which was of course the main cash crop, you needed a lot of labor. And conveniently in 1619, as most of us know, the first enslaved Africans arrived here in Virginia on a ship called the White Lion that unfortunately set off generations and decades and centuries of slavery here in Virginia. You'll see here, this is a tobacco print block and label. Daniel's Best Tobacco at Mile End. This is a British factor, a tobacco factor. And if you look closely, you can see here in the background an enslaved African harvesting the tobacco. So there's definitely a visual connection between the source of labor and the wealth that white people were building. And, there's unfortunately also not a lot of documentation from this period of time about how people felt about enslavement, but you can kind of see attitudes reflected in things like court cases, laws, and legal documents. You can glean out things from the archives and that way. And I it's hard to read. I know a lot of these old documents are challenging, but it's a deed essentially from 1682, deeding an enslaved person to the white person, the enslavers' descendants. So you're starting to see by the 1660s, 1680s, especially, a transition between what many historians have called a society with slaves here in Virginia to the beginning of something called like a slave society. So this deed, you can see, is sort of the foundation again of generational wealth that we will get to further on in our discussion. All right, so we're moving kind of into the 18th century here. Some historians have called this the golden age of Virginia, right? So society is stabilizing, people aren't dying at rapid rates. There's a little bit more economic stability, cultural stability, and unfortunately, this is the period in which slavery becomes incredibly entrenched in Virginia society. Again, going into that transition between a society with slaves and a slave society. I wanted to just read here really quickly from part of something called an Act Concerning Servants and Slaves. It was 1705. Many historians have just called this the Slave Code of 1705. And if you look at it, there's actually images of it online. You can find it in Henning Statues Encyclopedia. Virginia has a good entry on it. It is just pages and pages and pages of slave codes. It's very visually stunning. It's a huge statement. It's really also just a compendium, I never know how to say that, a compilation of basically all of the 17th century legislations and acts that were concerning slavery and put them all in just one big place. And again, if you'll let me read just really quickly, part of it says, "And if any slave resists his master or owner or other person by his or her order correcting such slave and shall happen to be killed in such correction, it shall not be accounted felony, but the master, owner, and every such other person so giving correction shall be free and acquit of all punishment and accusation for the same as if such incident had never happened." And I bolded that just to really point that out. This is basically saying if a white person kills an enslaved person in the course of correction, nothing will happen. It's as if such incident had never happened. That's incredibly powerful and tells you quite a lot about the mindset of the people making these laws and benefiting from them. Here also, on the other side of my screen, there's another deed. And again, it's hard to read. And I'll read just briefly sort of the first parts of it. And it says, "Know all men by these presents that I, Margaret McGoran of the parish of Whitechapel in the county of Lancaster, spinster," which is, nice designation, "for and in consideration of the sum of £100 to me in hand paid by William Fates, gentleman of the parish of St. Stephen's in the county of Northumberland, the receipt whereof I do hereby acknowledge and him thereof do exonerate and discharge. Have bargained, sold, and delivered, and by these presents do bargain, sell, and deliver unto the said William Fates, one Negro fellow named Ben, together with 5 cows and their future increase, with 9 sheep, and 10 head of hogs, 3 feather beds and furniture, 2 pots and 1 dishes and 6 plates." Just that list too. The man named Ben, he's being sold and traded along with feather beds and cows and hogs. So you can really see again how people are understanding the relationship of the enslaved to their own interests and to their own creation of wealth. We will fast forward. That's a lot of text. I actually did that on purpose to overwhelm you guys a little bit. This is actually at the time of the American Revolution, slightly afterwards. This is Richard Randolph's will. Richard Randolph was a member of the Randolph family, again, another very prominent family in Virginia. He was Thomas Jefferson's nephew and a major property owner. He did something pretty extraordinary. And he, on his death in his will, and you can see it here, he freed his enslaved people and granted them land in Prince Edward County. There's a wonderful book called Israel on the Appomattox by Melvin Ely about this story. And he was exceptional, but also representative. The American Revolution really forced Virginians to self-assess. There were all these sort of revolutionary ideas about freedom, liberty, Christianity, people's natural rights. Thomas Jefferson and others were discussing slavery very seriously, sort of as a moral danger to Virginians. And to be clear, they weren't necessarily worried about the welfare of Black people or the enslaved, but they were realizing that the institution of slavery was a threat to the safety of white people. There's quite a lot of interest in manumissions. Manumission laws were liberalized for the first time, so there was a pretty significant increase in free Black people in the Commonwealth. So it's a sort of interesting time. And I kind of want to go a little bit, again, reading into the archives here. It's a very complicated preamble to his will. You can see, to express my abhorrence of the theory, oops, we'll go back. There we go. To make retribution as far as I'm able to the unfortunate race of bondsmen over whom my ancestors have usurped and exercised the most lawless and monstrous tyranny, and in whom my countrymen, by their iniquitous laws, in contradiction of their own declaration of rights, and in violation of every sacred law of nature, of the inherent, inalienable, and imprescriptible, can't say that, rights of man, and of every principle of moral and political honesty, have invested me with absolute property. To express my abhorrence of the theory, as well as the infamous practice of usurping the rights of our fellow creatures, equally constituted with ourselves, in the enjoyment of my liberty and happiness. To exculpate myself, again, he goes on and on. There's an interesting part here. To declare to them is the world that nothing but uncontrollable necessity forced on me by my father, who wrongfully bound over them to satisfy the rapacious creditors of a brother, and who, for this purpose, which he falsely believed to be generous, mortgaged all his servants to British harpies for money to gratify pride and pamper sensuality, sorry about that, by which, Freudian slip, by which mortgage the said servants being bound, et cetera, et cetera. So there's quite a lot going on here. There's a lot of guilt. There's this thoughts on natural rights. There's sort of this sort of moment of reflection. And he, again, Richard Randolph, was exceptional in the length that he went to help the people that he manumitted. And unfortunately, most people in Virginia at this time did not take these actions. It is important to also say that the post-revolutionary moment in Virginia was one of economic downturn primarily. There was a general switch from tobacco to wheat and other grain crops. Many were sort of speculating that slavery as an institution would die out naturally. So there is a sort of hint of self-interest in some of these people who were reflecting on whether slavery as an institution should survive and was morally justified. Unfortunately, as we all know, slavery as an institution did not die out naturally here in Virginia. The Louisiana Purchase opened up vast new territories that would eventually become the Cotton South. Virginia became a source of enslaved people to places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. The cotton gin obviously expedited this process. There is, again, a wonderful book called The Ledger and the Chain by Joshua Rothman that, if you're interested in this history, really dives into this. There's also Edward Baptist, The Half Has Never Been Told, that talks about the creation of the domestic slave trade, of which Virginia was a huge part. Franklin and Armfield, again, the trading company that I mentioned in the first slide, was absolutely crucial to this part of Virginia history. At this point, too, a lot of Virginians were justifying slavery through, again, morality and religion. There was sort of a paternalistic attitude that cast Black people as unable to take care of themselves, or they could not survive or thrive without the help and care of white people. Slavery becomes something of a positive good. Pausing sort of briefly, I want to talk about this photograph. It's entitled African American Woman Holding a White Child. We don't know who took this picture or really who these people were, but I chose it because it's such sort of a powerful image and encapsulates so much. So many questions that we could ask here. One, who are they? Why did this picture get taken? Who chose to take it? What is their body language? Who is this girl? It was very common for young enslaved girls and women, young women, to take care of the enslavers' white children. We sort of have that creation of the mammy myth that came out of it. But what was she feeling? Like, was she proud to take this picture? Did she want freedom? Did she feel special that this was being taken? Again, why did people choose to take this photograph? What's her relationship with that child? Sort of all of these questions just allow us to get into the mental and emotional space of the people who enslaved people, to really think about why was this okay? What did they feel and think about it? And then on the other side, you can also see there's another unidentified artist. This is a painting called Virginian Luxuries. There was, of course, at this period of time too, pressure being put on enslavers from abolitionists. You can see here too, I think it sort of just really encapsulates sort of the horror of slavery. You see an enslaver kissing or attempting to kiss a enslaved woman, presumably, and then in the other panel, he is forcing a Black man to work. So really just shows the brutality of the institution itself. So why do these stories matter? So I think a huge part of why sometimes we struggle with this history, especially here in Virginia, is, to paraphrase the great historian David Blight, the South lost the war, but it won the narrative. Of course, the creation of the lost cause narrative immediately following the Civil War and into the 1920s with the 19 teens and the 20s with the erection of all those statues. The United Daughters of the Confederacy really put on an extended campaign to influence education. Here we have something called a measuring rod to test textbooks and reference books in schools, colleges, and libraries, published in 1920. And the first sentence says, "Reject a book that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel and unjust to his slaves." That is quite a statement. Reject a textbook that glorifies Abraham Lincoln and vilifies Jefferson Davis. And it just goes on and on and on in that vein. And also here we have The Story of Virginia, which was a textbook from 1950. To read very briefly, Thomas Nelson Page, who was a little boy in old Virginia, has left us delightful stories of children in those golden days. The little white boys played with their little brown body servants. They rolled over one another like little puppies. They jumped over one another's backs in their games of leapfrog. They were fast friends and fought for one another as well as with one another. They grew up to be loyal friends and laughed together in later years over their hunting and fishing excursions, rabbit traps, and washing in the creeks. So you're really seeing, quite a whitewashing of this, right? Which tells us more about the people who wrote these narratives and needed these narratives than it does the people of the 19th century. And moving on to today. So again, I think what I'm trying to really do, hopefully doing an okay job with it, is trying to sort of raise questions instead of necessarily providing a lot of answers. So I've put here a snippet from the website from Barclay Plantation on the James River advertising their wedding venue. Host your wedding and reception at Barclay Plantation. One of the things, as you drive the tree line lane leading to Barclay, you'll know you're not on the grounds of just any plantation. So again, the creation of these myths based on these historical realities is pretty amazing to see. We have here an example of how violence can come from these ideologies. This is, of course, the photograph from the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville on August 12th, 2017, when protesters were allegedly defending the Robert E. Lee statue that was due to come down. And we have a more recent statue here, Emancipation and Freedom Monument here in Richmond, talking about, of course, emancipation and freedom, and also Richmond's role in the domestic slave trade. So pretty powerful examples of how we are still reckoning with this history. The work is not yet done. And thank you for being here and being part of this conversation, which I think will hopefully help further the discussion. So on that note, are there any questions or comments or things you would like to talk about?
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I certainly learned a lot in this as well. And I think that there isn't one, pat answer that you can say that covers all the questions, but definitely a role of a history organization to raise those questions and provide space for reflection. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
As I mentioned at the beginning, feel free to add your questions or comments to the Q&A function or to the chat. And we do have one to kick us off here from Janet. It says, what is the VMHC doing to help resolve the emotional issues surrounding recent suggested changes in the Virginia history curriculum, particularly to support teachers who will be or are in the crosshairs of differing viewpoints?
Whew. Yeah, I was trying not to get political, but yeah, so we do have a really robust education program here. I'm not super familiar with exactly what the VMHC is doing, but I know that we have multiple teacher institutes. We offer support. We have programs for teachers to come, even just day-long things, workshops, to really just get this history out here. And I think the VMHC as an institution in general, we're committed to telling inclusive stories using responsible methods, right? So I tried, as you saw, all of the sources that I shared, they're primary sources, they exist, they're in the archives, they're in the records, they're facts. So we are trying to arm teachers and the public in general with those materials to just support, an inclusive narrative.
Yes, I would second. So Elizabeth mentioned we do have teacher institutes. We have 2 week-long teacher institutes in the summer that are supported by Weinstein Properties. And then we have virtual teacher recertification classes throughout the school year, as well as both in-person and virtual tours of galleries and educational programs that our VMHC educators can directly speak to teachers and students and make sure that we are sharing our collections and making sure that students feel that they can have a connection to history and make sure that they know that, you know, history isn't over, it's still happening. So I think it's really important that we provide a space to tell all stories.
Absolutely.
We got another question here from Helen. You mentioned that we'd learn how to read the archives. Can you please elaborate?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so one of the things, you know, that I find really fascinating about of history is sources are not neutral, right? Someone made them. Every sort of piece of paper, there's a story behind it, there's an argument, and it's sort of sussing out who made it, why, what was it for? It's sort of who, what, where, when, why, how, right? What was the motivation behind it? What purposes is it serving? What are the deeper stories, you know, behind this? One of I'm actually working on a exhibit on free Black people in Virginia, which is my first major assignment. It'll be opening in June 2025, so please come check it out. And there's a document that I have come across that I absolutely love. It is basically a deed to land purchased by a free Black man named Benjamin Short. He had previously been enslaved. He was manumitted. He saved enough money to buy this land in Prince Edward County. And it's kind of a boring, bureaucratic piece of paper, right? Like when you buy a house, you sign the deeds. There's something inherently kind of special about it. But what is so magnificent and so powerful about this piece of paper, especially, is that he wrote his name on it, and it looks like, you know, a young person, we would think maybe like a kindergartner or first grader learning how to write. The letters aren't formed really well, like the N is backwards, but it's clear that he's learning how to read and write. You know, a previously enslaved man learning how to read and write and saved enough money to purchase land. Like that document tells that story, and it's just so powerful, right? So that's kind of what I mean, like how we learn to read the archives, digging deeper into the sources and sort of trying to find like a bigger meaning behind them. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. And this is, I think, a little bit tied to what you were just mentioning, but this is a question from Kate. Have you found diaries or letters discussing feelings about slavery, and where are they?
Yes. There are many. There are so many. We have plenty here. They're at the University of Virginia Library. They're at the Library of Virginia. They're all over the place. And it's sad to say, but most of them are like, yeah, we're pretty okay with it. Like that's kind of the gist. You know, I put up one of Landon Carter's, like an excerpt from his diary, which is also a very powerful document. And he talks about, you know, his interactions with his enslaved people and how he is so affronted when they run away, or he doesn't understand why they aren't grateful that he's taking care of them. You know, so you can clearly see sort of this attitude of entitlement, and like a little emotional coercion, I will be honest, and call it that. You know, but the other thing that I often find too is people in the letters, diaries, etc., sometimes discussing their enslaved people, the sort of callousness of the language is shocking. They're speaking about people like they're inherently sort of meaningless unless they are directly performing some sort of labor that benefits the enslaver, right? So they're pawns in some ways, which speaks to the creation of white supremacy and sort of the horror of the institution of slavery itself, that people became instruments instead of people. So it's really humbling. It's really fascinating to look at these documents and recollections, but pretty horrible stuff, not gonna lie. But important, very important to see.
And are some of those documents and diaries, you mentioned they're in our collection, and to note for members, of course, and for the public, our research library is open to the public, and you can always request to view documents and read the original papers and hold them in your properly clean and delicate hands, but you can look at that history yourself, which I always think is really powerful as well.
It's incredibly powerful, and it again sort of I iterate, like, it really connects you to the past in a tangible way, that I think is incredibly powerful. Like, these were real people doing real things, and you can't really deny that when you're holding their diary in your hand.
Mm-hmm. We do have time for a few more questions, so feel free to add them to the Q&A or the chat. We have a question here from Karen. In your research, what was one of the more interesting period accounts you found from an enslaver of their emotional response to slavery? And have you found any acknowledgments of the inhumanity and paradoxes of being an enslaver? I know you mentioned there are a lot of accounts where there isn't this grappling, but have you found accounts that are?
Yeah, there are examples of people, especially sort of later into the 18th century and into the 19th, especially as abolitionism was taking hold, who are grappling with this question: is this moral? Is this just? I think Richard Randolph is a great example. He wrote pretty prolifically about this in his sort of private papers and in his correspondence with family members. He was the person, again, if you'll remember, who emancipated his enslaved people and gave them land. So there were people grappling with these questions, talking about it. Maybe it's an unfortunate thing of humanity is that people are really adept at cognitive dissonance and understanding something might be sort of morally wrong, but it benefits them, so they put up with it, right? And I can think of multiple examples in our own society where that is happening. So sometimes it's just sort of an unfortunate feature of humanity that we are able to do that. And even, maybe one of the most sort of famous examples is Thomas Jefferson, to a certain extent. He wrote about the dangers of slavery and how he understood that it was sort of a moral wrong. But again, a lot of what he wrote was couched in the language of slavery as an institution is dangerous to the well-being of white people and the morality of white people. So there's this multiple levels to this. There's no one answer. There's no one experience. You'll find examples of people who were sort of on all sides of this question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then we do have another question here from Sandy. How are descendant stories and oral history included in your source materials?
Ooh, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, I will say I have to dig more into that. There's the WPA narratives that are pretty famous of formerly enslaved people who were interviewed in the 30s. But I have not yet, and that's sort of a blind spot. Thank you for pointing it out, Sandy. Really dug into descendant stories yet. It's something I'm really interested in doing for the exhibition that I'm working on. I think it's really important to have those voices included. But I have not done it in my own original research. But thank you. Now I will.
And then we have another question here from Helen. What are your insights into the Jim Crow era? And what are the main themes that resonate with you in the justification of that era?
Whew.
I know we're coming in hard with questions. These are all good questions.
No, these are
to
wonderful
ask,
questions.
Certainly not there are no pat answers.
No, but these are the type of questions that I was really hoping that, this talk would sort of percolate, right? Undeniably the Jim Crow era, like the attitudes and the feelings are a direct legacy of the century that came before it. Again, you can see sort of the justifications of, oh, well, Black people are dangerous, they're animalistic, all of these things, they have to be controlled. These are directly related to attitudes related to slavery, right? And the legacy. And then throw on top of that the lost cause narratives. And just, I kind of think of all of this as a continuum of the history of white supremacy and the various iterations and justifications that people use to uphold it, right? Things change over time, attitudes and thoughts change, but it's sort of the same beast that keeps coming up. And I would argue that we're still grappling with that today in our own society. Again, history isn't neat. We categorize it, historians categorize it in sort of various ways that make sense if you're writing a book and you have to put dates on it. But it all sort of, I think, just kind of flows and ebbs together. So, and I think a big challenge is leaning into the history and its discomfort, and using that discomfort to hopefully inspire change in our own lives and our own society.
Yes, I think I agree with that. I think there's so much of history that we want to put it in neat little boxes. And history, the more you look at history, the more the boxes open and there are no boxes.
Yes.
And it's all just there together, like our lives are, all just, a mixture of various aspects.
Absolutely.
Well, I don't see any more questions, but I so appreciate everyone's participation in our Q&A. I know Elizabeth and I both appreciated the thoughtful reflection and deeper dives into this really multifaceted topic. So as we close out today, I know I mentioned it earlier, and so did Elizabeth, but we do have a research library where Elizabeth does a lot of her research. We have a collection of over 9 million artifacts. A lot of that is paper and manuscripts. So we have a lot of people and sources to review. And of course, that research library is always open to members and to the public to come and do your own research. And as Elizabeth mentioned, we do have an upcoming exhibition in 2025 that will discuss the stories of freed Black men and women in the state of Virginia, which I know will be very interesting when that comes about. And Elizabeth did mention earlier, but Israel on the Appomattox, I forget the author's name, but I have read that and it is a fascinating book. So I would recommend that to anyone who wants to read more about that really interesting chapter in Virginia history. And I would be remiss if I didn't say before we closed out that we do have some other member events coming up in the next month. So we have our last Member Monday of the season at Virginia House. That will be on Monday, October 16th. So that's a week from today. The weather should, knock on wood, be perfect. And members, of course, can attend for free. We just ask that you register beforehand so that you can let us know that you're coming. It will be from 5:30 to 7:30, and there will be live jazz music while you enjoy the evening in our lovely historic garden. And then we have our member-only evening lecture. The J. Harvey Wilkinson Jr. lecture will be on Wednesday, October 18th. And that is a lecture held exclusively for members, and tickets are on sale on our website. And then finally, our next curator conversation will be on Monday, December 4th, and it will be in keeping with our tradition of closing out our calendar year with a curator roundtable going through our curators' top picks of our recent acquisitions for 2023. So we will see Elizabeth and the rest of our curatorial team back on Monday, December 4th. And thank you all so much for joining us this morning. And of course, as always, for your support as members. We so appreciate that. And we hope very much to see you in the galleries or at an event in the next couple of weeks here. And if we don't see you before the next time we meet, take good care, and we'll see you at the next one.